Okay, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I hope everyone is having a good day. Next slide, please. I'm Ryan Coughlin. I'm the Senior Director of Operations with Enterey, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Enterey, for those that may not be familiar with Enterey, we are a management consulting firm. We partner with organizations that want to orchestrate positive change within their company or their functional area. We do this through process improvement and effective project management. We at Enterey, we understand what it's like to have too much work and not enough time to get it done, or to be anxious and overwhelmed with all the challenges that you might be facing. It's frustrating to see the jobs that need to get done and not having enough time to get them done. So we have a proven methodology that we follow to help make that happen, and where we discover, design, and resolve. We try and discover your challenges. We tailor solutions to specifically meet your challenges, and then we implement those solutions partnered with your organization. So that's what Enterey is. Today, for today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on some of the challenges and opportunities we face in many of our delivery operations, and that is focused on talking about the challenges of working in teams and making decisions in teams. That's what today's webinar will be focused on. Leading the webinar will be Christina Kenny. So I welcome Christina Kenny, and I thank you very much for presenting today's topic. Christina is our director of our Northern California operations. She has over 15 years experience within the industry, within the industries, leading cross-functional teams. She's been with Enterey for over 5 years now, and she has expertise in quality systems, strategic project management, as well as knowledge management and knowledge transfer. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Christina and say thank you very much for presenting today's webinar.
Thank you, Ryan, for such a great introduction. And once again, welcome everyone to the webinar where we'll talk about decision-making in teams. So today I'm going to be talking less about logistics of team decision-making. I think we all know a lot about dot voting, consensus, etc. And I want to talk more about how to construct and work within our teams to make our decisions stronger. So we'll focus on first reminding about the benefits of team decision-making as well as the challenges. 3 of the key problems that we'll run into: composition problem, participation problem, and influence problem. And then finally look at some best practices to get the most out of your teams. So to start with, why do we work in teams at all? If teams invite challenges, why do we want to do this? To start with, groups consist of many members, so group performance is actually almost always better than the performance of an individual acting alone. And group decisions are generally more accurate than the decisions of any one individual because you get more information coming to the table. In addition to information, you get a wider set of perspectives, more varied abilities in your team, and it actually helps drive not only better decisions, but more creative solutions to problems. And ultimately, it encourages ownership of decisions. So within an organization, you're going to find that you have better acceptance and better support for the decisions when it comes time to implement them. So we've all probably experienced great results with teams, and we've all also likely experienced situations where groups fell flat, made worse decisions, took longer to accomplish things. So why does this happen? There is a name for it: process loss. So process loss is just the term for what we experience. It's an outcome in situations where groups perform more poorly than you would expect, given the characteristics of the members of the group. So times where you get a lot of great, intelligent, creative people together, and we just don't get the results we would expect. It's sort of the diminishing returns we may often experience when we work in teams. So if we look at this graphically, if we had a group size, let's pretend of 8, and each person we would estimate would be able to give a performance output of 100 units, well then simple arithmetic says we would expect that with 8 people and each person giving 100, we would get an output of 800 performance units. However, there's an effect that a few people have studied. What we find is that the actual output per person lessens the more people are in the group. So this is dubbed the Ringelmann effect, who was the first person to study this in a quantifiable manner. He actually studied this first on tug of war challenges. So it was something that was very easy to quantify in terms of strength output. But this has been studied in mental challenges as well as physical, and the effect still holds. This diminishing returns comes from challenges both with your team motivation and your team coordination. So how are your individuals performing within the team, and how well are you working together in the team? Because there are many ways and many things that contribute to this process loss, and many things we can do to counteract it. So with that said, I'd like to start talking about some of the main things that contribute to process loss. And we look at 3 kind of main buckets here. We'll look at dealing with team composition, or the composition problem, the participation problem, and the influence problem. So starting with composition, let's imagine that this large square is all of the information you would need to make a high quality decision. Obviously, no one has all of the information necessary, but if you bring together a group of people, in this case, group member A, group member B, group member C, each of them brings a little something unique to the table. And among the 3 of them, you're more likely to have all of the information necessary to make a high quality decision. But here's the composition problem. We are attracted to and more comfortable with people who are like us, people who are similar to us, people with similar thought patterns, points of view, etc. So you can imagine that's like having our problem here, same big square, but instead of 3 people who bring a lot of different information to the table, we have 3 people who pretty much bring the same information to the table. And as I mentioned before, one really key reason this happens is that we naturally look for people similar to us. So we have a tendency to oversample the same pieces of information. And then we unintentionally compose groups that lack the diversity of information, the diversity of perspective, and the sort of additive value that we find that makes teams really provide value. So this is, you're losing information just because you're not inviting the right people to the table. Another reason the composition problem can happen is that you start to, especially if you're in a leadership position, reach for the same people who performed well in the past. And you'll start to see a few people who, you know, oh, they did great in project A. I'm going to grab them here to solve problem B. Oh, they did great in problem A and B. I'm going to have them again lead problem C. You start reaching for the same people, even the same group of people, and your focus gets smaller and smaller. The mental models that people bring, the diversity of thought gets smaller and smaller. And I'll also point out that there's a risk of overburdening those who end up performing well. So a few reasons composition problems can happen. The second issue that we can run into can be described as the participation problem. So we can do a great job of composing the group, but we're only going to make a good decision if those group members share their unique information and perspectives. So imagine for a moment, we've got a group of about 6 people. if they are discussing a problem, typically there are going to be about 2 people who want to talk all the time. There's probably going to be another 2 who want to talk occasionally, and then another 2 people who probably are going to be happy watching the other 4 people talk. Those people who want to watch are called spectators. Spectating can happen for a number of reasons. The first and most obvious is that airtime is a limited resource. It really can be challenging to make sure everyone gets the space to contribute. Some people may become spectators in a particular team just because they can't get a word in edgewise. Another thing to consider, especially on global teams, is cultural differences. So in some cultures, it can be considered perhaps disrespectful to ask questions in a meeting or contradict someone who is speaking. When you have people who come from a culture like this in the same team as someone from a culture that considers verbal participation an attribute and a value, you amplify the likelihood that a few people will always speak and a few people never will. Third, we have social loafing. This is what people likely assume is the reason that people don't participate. Just the more people, the assumption that other people are going to pick up my slack. I don't have time to spend on the pre-read. Gosh, I know Harriet's going to read this, so I'm just going to wait for her to contribute in the team, and then I'll agree with whatever she says. Or in a less conscious way, diffuse responsibility can lead to everyone doing a little less because we know we're not the only one accountable for this. And honestly, this is not always conscious. It's not always malicious. We're so spread thin today. I know I'm always looking for where I can economize my attention, and probably in my less fine moments, I'm loafing on some teams. We also have to be aware of evaluation apprehension. Humans are social creatures. We want to be part of a group. We want to be accepted by a group. It's common to be a little worried about offering your thoughts because what will everyone think? Will they evaluate and find me wanting? Lastly, and I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced this, but I know I sometimes have an assumption that everyone else knows the things that I know. If I know something, obviously everyone else must know it, right? So especially if I'm in a team with senior leaders, I'm in a team with experts, these are incredibly smart people. And it can be really easy to forget that I may just have access to a set of information or a perspective that they don't. When you combine this with the evaluation apprehension, you have a situation where I really, really don't want to bring something up because, hey, they must already know it and there must already be a reason they're not discussing it. And I don't want to be seen as stupid for bringing it up. The last of the 3 main problems is the influence problem. Just what it sounds like. This is when people are influenced by others in the group. Now, this is not always a bad thing. We want to be open to new ideas and information to help us form opinions, right? But it can be a slippery slope. So we don't like not knowing things. Especially, I would say, especially those in life sciences, we're used to being able to search for data to help us out of living in ambiguity. And remember, we're in a land of uncertainty and ambiguity when we're making decisions, because if there was nothing uncertain, we wouldn't even have to make a decision. So without realizing it, when we're coming together, we might latch onto others early to resolve our uncertainty. And we might latch onto others even if they don't have all the information, just because it's like we're looking for any informational port in a storm, if you will. So the second piece of what we're looking at is conformity pressures. So groupthink, I think we've all probably heard of this. You might be aware of it. There was a psychologist named Ash who completed a series of studies that highlighted conformity pressures. And I'd like to share a clip with you now.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3,
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2, 2, 2, 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1, 1, 2, 1, 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner.
All right, so I love that clip for many, many reasons. The first of which is the amazing fashion and hairstyles, right? It's a nice little throwback. So there's a few things at work in that experiment that increased pressure for the subject, and I'd like to acknowledge those now. So he needed to state his opinion out loud, and he needed to do so after hearing a consensus or in a unanimous agreement beforehand. So it increased the pressure, and it highlighted what would be an anti-group position. The other thing I do want to acknowledge, it was also a pretty low stakes situation, right? There's not a lot of long lasting effects from identifying a wrong sized line. Some other key takeaways, though, from this series of studies that were done. In over 1/3 of the trials, someone made a decision to join the majority and give a wrong answer. So only 1/4 of people never conformed to the majority. So it's very, very easy and very likely that we might, in situations, be pushed towards agreeing, even if we don't necessarily believe so. And especially in a situation where we're all at danger of conforming. So the question is, with the composition problem, with the participation problem, and with the influence problem, how do we deal with these? So let's move on to best practices. So how do we improve the performance of our teams? The first thing we want to look at is team size. Target a team size of about 5 people. Definitely no more than 7. And there's a few reasons for this. The first is that you need to quite simply take into account the amount of airtime there is. Back when we talked about participation, more people you have, the less time there is for each person to offer their perspectives. Therefore, it's just more likely you're going to have people sitting back. Second, there's been a little bit of research done about decision-making specifically. Once you've got 7 people in a decision-making group, each additional member actually lowers decision effectiveness by about 10%. In addition, the larger the group, the larger the danger of groupthink. So those conformity experiments that we just saw, they did find that group size influenced whether people conformed. The more people you had already agreeing on something, the more likely it was that we were going to go along with the majority. The second piece is when forming your teams, beware of something that's called the inclusion gap. You want to make sure that your decision-making teams reflect your organization as a whole. And therefore, you're able to leverage the value that diversity in perspectives and thought processes bring. So even diverse and very inclusive organizations may sometimes end up having decision-making teams that aren't inclusive. Diversity itself provides a lot of benefits, even just showing the signal of surface level diversity. It helps remind people in the group that there may be underlying opinion differences or perspective differences. And it helps people who have an opinion or a perspective that they think is different to feel comfortable sharing that. Simply interacting also with people who are different than us forces us to prepare better, to anticipate alternate viewpoints, to expect that reaching consensus will take effort. I know in the past, there's one person that I've worked with on a lot of teams, and I love working with them because we kind of have the same mental models of the world. We have the same thought processes. You know, we don't need to say everything out loud. We just kind of go along and we can expect or anticipate what the other person is going to say. And that's fun. But what we find is by skipping over having to say our assumptions out loud, we can even forget that we're making those assumptions. It's when I have to work with someone who has a different thought process, who gathers information differently, comes at things from a different perspective, that we actually start really leveraging the diversity and pushing each other to prepare more inside a group and ultimately come up with better decisions. So we also are familiar with, hey, we need to include stakeholders if we're going to make a decision. I'd like you to pay attention, think back the last couple of times you've brought together some people to make a decision. Are you just reaching out to the same person, the same point of contact from each function? If you have, it's incredibly common, incredibly useful. And I want to challenge you to form a group without those people the next time. So you can ask yourself things like, all right, who haven't I asked to the table or invited to the table? You can also, if you'd like some extra credit, ask yourself, who's most likely to disagree with changes that we make in my team? Who's most likely to spend more time asking why we're doing something or why we have been doing something in the past? You probably can find that having those people on a team, having that alternate perspective or new participation can really prompt the group to widen their viewpoint. The next thing is you want to prioritize psychological safety. Psychological safety, it refers to an individual's perception of the consequences of taking a risk. So if a team has what's termed high psychological safety, Then teammates feel safe to take risks. They feel pretty sure that no one on the team is going to embarrass them or punish anyone else for admitting a mistake, asking a question, offering a new idea. The amount of psychological safety ends up having a huge impact on how well a team works together and how much each team member participates. So you have to make this a priority. As a leader in teams, the very first thing you can do to start building this is to lead by example. Admit when you don't know something. Admit when you made a mistake. Offer it up. Be transparent. Ask questions. Suggest things that are kind of outside the status quo. The second thing you can do, and this can be harder, is to allow people to offer their own creative solutions without immediately responding with why they won't work, to allow people to disagree without trying to, keep the agenda on track and move us along quickly. As a leader, the other thing you need to do is be really vigilant about spectators. Watch for the watchers. I think it's especially important to encourage everybody to speak, if not in the first meeting, at least in the first 2 meetings. So early participation, I've found in my experience, is extra important because we fall into habits, teams fall into habits, the way we function with other people. So if I have people who aren't speaking in the first couple of meetings, they just get very comfortable not speaking and not participating. So one thing I do that I will admit the virtual world has made a little easier is with a new team, I will have a piece of paper the first meeting and I've written everyone's name down on it. And the first time I speak, I cross their name off. And if it's getting towards the end of the meeting and I see maybe there's a person who hasn't contributed or hasn't spoken, I might actually call them out, ask if they can offer their perspective. Hey, Lauren, I know that you just completed a project that looked at a large volume of document changes. Do you have any best practices on how we should build the plan? This really encourages it, and you'll get a better job. You'll get lessons spectating from most of your people. The next piece here is disagreement. Disagreement is natural and it should be expected, but we know it can take courage for someone to disagree with a team, especially if everyone else seems aligned. So I look to leaders to make disagreement comfortable, and more than that, to make disagreement an inherent part of every meeting. A really simple way is to appoint a devil's advocate. A lot of people are used to this. Someone who can speak up to offer another opinion. I've found actually that very often I only need to have a devil's advocate the first 2 or 3 meetings, because by then people will be so used to having conversations conversations and challenges without interpersonal conflict, that it builds that psychological safety and we're more comfortable sharing different perspectives. Just remember, as a leader, it can be very hard to feel like someone is constantly disagreeing, but that is the kind of person who can really challenge your group to be creative, to continue to learn and be open. Having people who are going to stand back and say, wait, hold on a second, why are we doing this? What if we turned it around and inside out and looked at it that way? It provides and it spurs people into providing additional value, additional perspectives, even highlighting their assumptions and thought processes. It's also important to understand and respect each individual's areas of expertise and interest. So another example of process loss is that groups do have the ability to ignore the expert on a subject and end up democratizing decisions. So you run the danger that if the majority feels one way, you may make a decision regarding a subject about which you have no expertise, ignoring the expert on the team. What I do when I bring a team together is at the beginning, I have people share their background, I have people share their experience, I have people share their interests, what they're hoping to bring to the team. So it's important. We can only build off of people's strengths and we can only build off of people's skills if we recognize them and acknowledge that we all bring different things to the table and we want to build off of the best of everyone rather than averaging it out. So next, in case you haven't figured out by now, I am a naturally talkative person. I love nothing more than to contribute in a meeting. I have to watch myself to not take up all the airtime. I also recognize there are people who are the opposite, who don't like speaking in meetings, and we need to make sure teams are offering different ways to contribute. Speaking up in a meeting should not be the only way someone can offer their perspective, their thought, their information. Think about using collaborative documents. Think about having collaborative agendas even. This is a topic we should all talk about. Think about offline conversations, one-on-ones, etc. Just other ways that people are able to really engage in their sort of natural habitat, if you will. So with pre-work, when I talk about pre-work as a plus, a few things. There's the very obvious, which is let's send out our materials in advance. Let's send out pre-reads before every meeting. It's really important, as we talked about, even with different ways of working and different ways of participating, especially in global teams where we're not working in everyone's native language. Giving materials in advance is a great way to allow people to reflect, people who want to take some time to think on things themselves before a meeting. Pre-work is really valuable for that. What I also want you to think about is pre-work in terms of prompting people to form their thoughts, to form their opinions, to gather information and perspectives before everyone knows what everyone else thinks. So this is a way to mitigate the influence problem. Post-it brainstorming is a great way to do this. In the non-COVID world, when we were all in the same room, I would give everyone a little stack of Post-its and we'd think about the problem. And for 5 minutes, we would be silent. We would write ideas on Post-its. So this is an opportunity for everyone to be asked to, what are your thoughts? What are your opinions? After that time, we'd go up, stick them on the wall, and you'd start to see where themes emerge. But doing it this way really prevents people from kind of latching on to the first thing that's said. The final thing to think about is if you are in a meeting and perhaps you don't need to go the full brainstorming Post-it idea, think about reversing the hierarchical order. And what I mean is, do not have the person with the highest power in the room, the highest title in the room, offer their opinion first. If I have a meeting with the president of our company, I can bet you $5 that if he shares his opinion on something, that the vast majority of people will say, absolutely, that's exactly what I think too. So think about in your group, all right, who has the most implied power here? Who has the highest title here? Who has the ability to, without really even meaning to influence everyone else here. And then kind of ask for people's thoughts and perspectives in a reverse order. There have been 1 or 2 times where I've actually, before a meeting, reached out and said, hey, I know you're the head of the group. Maybe let's sit back for a minute and let everyone else offer something before we come in. And it really has prompted more of a level group feeling. So to sum up, look, you can get the best out of your team. It requires some preparation, it requires some thought, implementing some best practices, but it is certainly not impossible. So to close us out, I'd like to share this quote by Steve Jobs. Great things in business are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people. The quality of a decision, I truly believe, is dependent on the amount of information available. But simply having more people on a team does not guarantee better decision making. If you can optimize team motivation, team coordination, you can take advantage of all of the additional information, all of the additional perspectives that each member provides. And you can use this diversity to see the promise of teams fulfilled. I'd like to pause there and ask if we have any questions.
Hello, Christina. We did have a couple questions, and I would ask that if anyone has any additional questions, they can just post them in the chat. But we did have a couple, so I'll give you the first one here. How do you manage it when disagreements within the team become heated?
It's a great question because I think it can happen, and it definitely is the fear of a lot of people. So what I do when I'm in those situations is I actually call out what's happening, right? Recognize and say, hey guys, seems like we're getting things a little heated. Can we take a breath and maybe try and restate where the disagreement lies? By acknowledging that we all have feelings, we don't want people to pretend they have zero feelings when they come into a meeting, right? We're people, we're not a cog. But by acknowledging what's going on, rather than trying to pretend that there isn't any discomfort, I find that most people will take a breath and take a step back. So that's typically how I will respond in those situations.
Great, thank you. Okay, a second question. I know you talked about pre-work and the benefits of pre-work and everything. Someone asked, what do you do if people aren't completing their pre-work or contributing?
Also a great question, because I think this happens a lot, and I do try and address it early on, once again, because I think people get into patterns. They start expecting certain things in the meeting. And my approach would probably be different depending on if it's just one person who's not participating or not doing their pre-work. I might talk with them a little offline. If it's multiple people, if it's kind of everyone on the group kind of not doing everything, I like to take away from the team any diffused responsibility. And that means I am going to chop things up and ask, hey, Nancy, you specifically, can you prep A, B, and C to present it at the next meeting? And Ryan, can you research X, Y, and Z, and can you share that output at the next meeting? Because suddenly then when one is accountable for the whole thing, you can't really social loaf. And we highlight everyone's individual contribution at the meeting. And I find that the ability to sort of remind everyone that a team is made up of individuals and individual participation is important, kind of hammers that. And I will also admit there is a teeny little bit of the, like, people don't want to be called out. So if they have something that they need to present on a day, they don't want to show up and say, oh, this was only me and I couldn't do it. There's a little extra of that in there.
Great, thank you. And then one last question, but what advice would you give someone when they get to choose their team or their group, and you know you need more diversity and thought in your team? How do you go through and make those decisions?
Good question. And it can be hard, right? Because I think we need to all acknowledge that when we need to make a decision, it's because there's a problem. There's something going on in business that we want to improve, that we want to adjust. And it's it's not feasible to just tell everyone to kind of, throw a dart, pick a random name, right? We don't want to do that. If you have the time though, take a look at perhaps what are the abilities that you need on the team. Challenge yourself to not pick out 80% of the same people that you've used in the past. But once you've identified who's impacted by my decision, who does the work, who receives the output of the process that my decision impacts, do I sort of know my functional areas? Very often I will maybe ask someone who I worked with on that team or in that area before, hey, who would you recommend that I bring onto this team? Kind of diffusing not just the people I know personally, but getting it to kind of like a second level or a third level connection. And if there's any one person where you immediately think like, oh, they make every meeting, they force us to talk through all of our assumptions, that's actually a good thing. Challenge yourself to bring one of those people on your team.
Great. Thank you very much, Christina. I think that is actually all the questions we have right now. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, Christina, for sharing this information with everyone. And thank you all for attending today.
Yes, thank you all for attending.
Take care.